Professor Richard Johnson. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be on your show, Paul.
Now, you, sir, stand accused of writing a series of absolutely profound and important research papers for human health. How do you plead?
Guilty. Guilty as charged.
You are most certainly guilty, as guilty as sin. So
there you go. You got me in trouble in the first minute.
Exactly. And so context for our listeners is I read a research paper of yours that just blew my mind. And I immediately reached out to you. It was called the fructose survival hypothesis as a mechanism for unifying the various obesity hypotheses, right?
There you go.
I reached out to you and said, hey, I just thought I'll throw it out there. Will you come on the podcast? And you said yes. And you sent me through another couple of research papers on linked to that. And they are, I think, pretty profound in terms of the impact of human health, particularly when it pertains to obesity, diabetes, which everybody knows that we have these massive increases in it, but also Alzheimer's disease, which is now the second biggest killer of all Australians.
Wow.
I don't know where
it's definitely real. It's definitely related to all these diseases. Our research is really trying to get at the core of what causes those diseases.
And the interesting thing was I was reading a research paper and I went, I've read bundles and bundles of research papers, and I've never read a research paper that had such rich anthropology in it, going right back to the great apes. And I'm like, Jesus, that's really unusual. And then I read a next research paper and I said, this guy must be a nephrologist as well. And then I looked up your bio. So can you take people on a brief tour of your professional history? Because it really is quite interesting.
Yes. Well, I did start off being an anthropology major and an archaeology major. And I've always had an interest in evolution and archaeology. And but when I went through medical school, I wanted to be a researcher, and I became very interested in the causes of big diseases. I wasn't so interested in rare diseases as much as I was, why are people developing diabetes? Why is it that when I'm rounding in the intensive care unit or on the medical ward, that everybody seems to have a syndrome of obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, and they all cluster. And so I became very interested in that. Although I was a kidney specialist, what I did was I followed my research, kind of followed where it took, I went where the research took me. And so my career has involved leaving the kidney, and I keep coming back to it, of course, because I love kidney disease and trying to figure that out. But I have ventured into many areas of research, and my research has included, resurrecting extinct genes, doing work with anthropologists and historians, working in the wild and working on hibernating animals and everything from racehorses to hibernating squirrels, to studies in nature, like looking at why tigers develop kidney disease, and a whole host of things. But basically, I've been following a path, and the path really related to a fundamental question. And the fundamental question is, what drives obesity, and can we find a cure for it? And the interesting thing is the way you can start is you go back in time and you look at when obesity first really manifested and what was associated with it. And it goes back to ancient times, but it was very rare for a very long period of time, and it was mainly a disease of the rich and the royalty. And it was linked actually with the ingestion of sweets, going all the way back to 500 BC. And it was associated with eating sugar. And by 1900, the overwhelming viewpoint was that sugar was the cause of obesity and diabetes.
That's right. People forget this, don't they?
They do, and it's absolutely super strong. Like there was a paper by a guy in around 1920 who was the health commissioner for the city of New York. Very famous guy. This guy was one of your first epidemiologists. His name was Haven Emerson. And he went on to get the Lasker Award, which is like the Nobel Prize. And it's only been given, I think, once in the entire 100 years that it's been given. It's only been given to an epidemiologist once.
Wow.
And Emerson was this New York City health commissioner. And he was like puzzled in the 1920s why diabetes was increasing, because in 1900, it was rare. You know how rare it was, Paul? 1 in 50,000 people.
You're kidding me.
Think about it. No. 1860, it was 1 in 50,000. In 1900, it was 2 in 50,000. So I'm off a little bit, but not much. It was rare. By 1950, it was about 5% of the population. And today it's like 10 to 12% of our population here in the US, but there's some places where it's like 25% of the population. If you go to Samoa or Kuwait, 25% of adults have diabetes. 25%. That's significant. Okay. That's like serious bad.
That's diabetes. Did you say that's
diabetes? Not even obesity.
Yeah.
Like if you go to Nauru, 80 to 90% of adults are obese or overweight. So it also, in 1900, 1 in 30 people were obese in the US, 1 in 30. And today it's over 40%, 40%.
It's crazy, isn't it? Now, interesting you mentioned, sorry, Richard, Nauru, somebody who we both know, Professor Grant Schofield. A good mate of mine actually has done a lot of studies in the Pacific Islands, and particularly Vanuatu, and one island there has got the highest rate of obesity and diabetes in the world. And he said it's because they ship in massive amounts of sodas. And they drink a ridiculous amount because water, there's not a lot of fresh water. So they drink a lot of sodas and they eat a lot of 2-minute noodles and these sorts of things. And he says it just screws their metabolism completely.
It's soft drinks screw everybody. Anyone who's drinking soft drinks, doesn't matter if you're from Nauru or Vanuatu, soft drinks are sort of poison. They really are bad. They contain so much sugar. In Nauru, when sugar was introduced in the 1920s, Jared Diamond pointed out that, at one point they're eating half a pound of sugar a day.
What?
And a day. Yeah, that's what he wrote. Diamond did, is this famous anthropologist, and he apparently was able to get data from the 1920s. And obesity and diabetes just blew up. Nauru just blew up. And in the 1920s, the world thought that sugar was the cause of obesity and diabetes. They had these stories of, sugar being introduced to the Native Americans, and then suddenly obesity and diabetes occurring. They could show it. The Emerson study, which he did in the New York City population, it was the rich people who were getting obesity and diabetes. The African Americans had low frequency of diabetes. It wasn't genetic. It was food. He directly linked it with sugar. And he actually did a study in Australia. His paper included looking at Australia. And Australia didn't have obesity or diabetes at that point compared to the US. And that was related to differences in sugar intake. So sugar at one point was considered the main risk factor. And Banting, Frederick Banting, got the Nobel Prize for discovering insulin, wrote in the 1920s that refined sugar was the cause of diabetes, type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
Then what happened? what happened was a very bright physician named Elliot Jocelyn came up with a different idea that was actually very persuasive. And his idea was that obesity and diabetes are not from eating sugar, but rather from just eating too much, and that we are victims of our own success. Society progressed to the point where the grocery stores are filled with food. We don't have to exercise, just jump in the car, take an escalator, wait for the food to be brought to you.
That's right. And now we
Where's
can just
my
order
food?
it. Now we can just order it on our phones. We don't even
There
have to
you
get off our
go.
arses.
Uber, have it Ubered to you, you know?
So that's the energy balance hypothesis.
Yes. And so the energy balance hypothesis, actually, Jocelyn coined the word overnutrition.
Yeah.
That wasn't a word before. He said, hey, you know what? People are eating too much and we're exercising too little. And it's basic physics. We call it thermodynamics. And too much in, too little out makes you big, fat, and stout. And I'm sorry, I've got a bad sense of humor. But the bottom line is, if you're eating too much and you're not exercising enough, you're going to gain weight. And he showed, that even though many people who are obese will argue they're not eating that much, that in general they're eating more than they should.
Yeah, I remember.
And it turns out that yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, I remember when I was doing my nutrition masters, they showed a study, I think it was by Prentice et al., where they gave doubly labeled water to people both lean and obese, and found, and just for the listeners, that's a way that you can absolutely determine how much energy has been used. And then when they compare what they say they've eaten, they know how much people are off. And lean people would underreport by 50 to 100 calories a day, and obese people would underreport by between 500 and 1,000 a day, right?
Yeah. But there is also this interesting finding that as we have obesity for a long time, our energy factories, which are these mitochondria, start to give out. And when that happens, we do drop our metabolism.
Yeah.
So there is a metabolism component for sure.
Can you talk us through that mechanism about the mitochondrial dysfunction?
Yeah. So basically, we had a big discovery. And I've been doing research for 30 years, but this happened around 2005 to 2010. We had this big discovery that there was something special about sugar that was different from other foods. And basically, sugar or table sugar is actually two sugars.
Yeah.
There's glucose and there's fructose, and they're bound together. And glucose is the main sugar in our blood. Fructose is the main sugar in fruit. But we do have low levels of fructose in our body, but we just tend to burn it very quickly. So our fructose blood levels are low compared to our glucose. And glucose is the main carb that we run on. And when you eat sugar, you're getting both glucose and fructose.
Yeah.
And our work showed that glucose tends to be an instant form of energy, but fructose has a different purpose. And it's to help gain weight in preparation for a time when you may not have food around. And that animals use fructose to help put on fat when they're not starving. They're trying to put on fat to make you gain fat to protect you from a time when you aren't going to have food. So like a bear will eat berries, lots of fruit that contains fructose, huge amounts, not like what we eat, 10,000 grapes, and they get a big slug of fructose, and that helps trigger fat accumulation. And so humans, when we eat natural fruits, we're actually getting the benefit of everything that's in the fruit, like vitamin C and all these great things. And we don't eat enough fruit to actually get a huge slug of fructose. If we want to get a huge slug of fructose, we drink a soft drink.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a very different thing. Natural fruits are good for people unless you're eating 100 of them at one setting, then in which case it's not. Okay.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Or if you're having the processed fruit juice, right?
Yes, processed fruit juice is fatal too. Okay,
yeah.
Absolutely. Apple juice. We love apple juice, but it's not, apple juice doesn't love you. It wants to increase your fat, make you pre-diabetic. I mean, it's good to be fat and pre-diabetic if you're going to try to survive a period of time where there's, a harsh winter where there's no food around. Okay. But the way we figured this out turned out to be a trick. This is a trick of nature. Nature is super smart. But what we do is normally when you eat, you're using the food to make energy. And the energy is made in those mitochondria. They make all this energy, and that's what we live by. Talk, think, walk, everything. Everything I do is requiring energy for me to do it. Thinking requires energy. So, the energy is critical, and that's why we eat, to get that energy. But think of energy as two types. Think of energy as the active energy that we're burning, and then there's a type of energy which we call stored energy, and that's fat. And stored carbohydrates is called glycogen. So you can store energy. And that's energy that's not tapped. It's waiting to be tapped. So when you need it, you break down the fat or you break down the glycogen, and that provides the energy when there's no food around. And when you go on a keto diet, you burn off the glycogen first because, and then you're burning fat. And that's what makes the ketones. And it's because of the carb restriction and you're burning fat, which is very useful, right? So when you eat food, the thinking was that you fill up the ATP, and then the extra energy goes into fat. This is the way Jocelyn was thinking about it, and this is the way the world was thinking about it. So when you're eating, the way we get fat is we fill up the gas tank with the active energy, and the rest of it goes into the fat. Sounds logical.
Yeah, that's what I was taught in my master's in nutrition, right?
Yeah, it's not the way it works. The way it works is this incredible move. And what happens is when you eat fructose, it damages the mitochondria that are making the energy, the ATP, the active energy. And so what happens is the ATP levels in the cells actually drops. And when it drops like 25%.
That completely blew my mind when I read that in your research paper.
It's been proven.
What?
That's what happens. And then the gas light on your car goes on and it says, time to fill up. Low power mode. We're going to go into a low power mode, and it's time for you to get to the gas station and fill up. And what happens in humans when you drop the ATP is it makes you hungry. Suddenly, you tell the brain, I don't have enough energy. I need to reduce my metabolism. I need to go to the grocery store and forage for food. And I'm going to find the food and I'm going to eat it. And it's all a move by nature to make you take in more food than you need, because actually it's kind of a fake drop in energy, right? I mean, it's like it's like a temporary thing. You eat the fructose, the energy goes down. You're hungry, you go and eat, but the problem is that normally when the energy goes down, there's the stored fat is that you burn the stored fat to provide the energy. But fructose not only blocks the ATP from being made, it blocks the fat from being broken down.
Mm.
And that double whammy keeps you in a low energy state, a low active energy state. So what happens is you keep eating, and the calories that come in, the mitochondria aren't working so well, so the calories end up going straight into fat.
Right. So it inhibits. It inhibits fat breakdown. It encourages fat storage. It increases hunger. It also impacts on leptin as well, and it just creates metabolic dysfunction, really, doesn't it?
Yeah. But to nature, it's not metabolic dysfunction. This is what it wants to do. It is a survival method. And it turns out it's used by a ton of animals to help them. It's used by the lemur because they don't have to hibernate from a cold winter, but they have to survive the hot, dry season when the water dries up and there's no fruit around. So they eat a lot of fruit to store fat and to make it through those dry seasons. And they actually hibernate, what they call it estivation. They find a hollow in a tree and they go in there and they drop their energy and just kind of live through this period by burning the little fat they have.
Wow.
And so it turns out that it's used, fat was a survival mechanism. I mean, whales don't drink water, don't drink salt water. So the way they get their fresh water is from the food they eat, but they can also get water from their fat. Mm. And it turns out that when you burn fat, you produce water.
Yeah.
So it turns out that creating fat in a whale and also is a survival mechanism. So, when we were looking at this, we said, oh, geez, fructose is distinct, from other foods and dropping the energy, and that seems to stimulate food intake. But what about animals that don't eat fruit? Where do they get their fructose, or do they get fructose? And then we discovered that the body can make fructose.
This was also, sorry, Richard, but when I read that, I'm like, holy shit. That we can have essentially de novo creation of fructose, or endogenous creation of fructose. So talk us about is it the polyol pathway that does this?
Yeah. So there's only one way you can make fructose in a human, and it's from glucose. And it's through specific enzymes called the polyol enzymes. And so some people call it the polyol pathway, but basically you can make fructose from glucose. And bad news, when you're eating French fries and rice and these high glycemic carbs, they're stimulating insulin in their own right, which is what everyone was thinking was the main cause of obesity. But it turns out from our work that although the insulin pathway is very important and it does cause obesity, the serious bad part comes from the glucose being converted to fructose. And when you eat foods that are what we call high glycemic, rice, potatoes, cereal, bread.
Breakfast, lots of breakfast cereals.
All those bad breakfast cereals, man. Breakfast cereals, oatmeal. God, I always thought oatmeal was healthy. Oatmeal raises the blood glucose about an hour after you eat. It'll, everybody's blood glucose goes up, some more than others. When it goes up, it triggers the conversion of some of that glucose to fructose. And then suddenly you're making fructose. And when you block fructose, the effects of French fries and potatoes really is dampened. A lot of the way those carbs cause obesity is because they stimulate fructose, and then the fructose drops the ATP, and then that makes you hungry and drives all those things. And now we know that this is actually driving Alzheimer's disease. And
let's get into that in a second, Richard.
Yeah, sure.
I just want people to really understand that. So we talked about this pathway and that you've shown that happens, but there's also been research in animal studies that shows if you block the fructose, that it actually has the opposite effect. And that's when we can really get a very, very strong conviction, isn't it? That you see something happens and it increases and it does all this stuff, but then you block it and that stuff doesn't happen. That's when you go, okay, now there's more than a smoking gun.
Right. Plus, there's a rare condition where people are born without the ability to metabolize the fructose, and they don't get obese and they don't get type 2 diabetes. Never been reported. They live normally.
Wow. Is that to do with fructokinase?
Or if you lack, there's a disease called essential fructosuria. But people argue it isn't a disease because you live, if anything, longer. It's a desired disease, if you want to call it.
Yes, absolutely.
It's a condition that I would like to have.
Yeah, we should be genetically modifying people to have that condition, right? And that would solve the obesity crisis.
It would definitely solve it. It would definitely solve it. I mean, so what happened with that paper you read about, joining the hypotheses?
Yes,
is that the fructose story is compatible with the energy balance story and with the low carb story.
Yeah, so we talked about two. Yeah. And before we get into Alzheimer's disease, can you also talk about the protein leverage hypothesis? Because I had two professors from Sydney. I can't remember their names now, but they were great talking about the protein leverage hypothesis. And so quickly take us through that, and then how fructose explains that as well, or plays into that as well.
Yes. Well, let me first just quickly explain how the fructose story can account for both the low carb and the energy balance, because the groups, those two groups, have been at war with each other.
Yes.
And so I mean, total war.
Okay? And you've come in as the peacemaker.
I hope so. Yeah, because they're both right. Exactly. So there was a huge meeting in London to try to bring everybody together to try to figure out what causes obesity. And pretty much all the main hypotheses were presented there. And the two most well-known ones are the energy balance. You eat too much, you're going to gain weight. And the other one is if you eat carbs, you're going to gain weight. And the energy balance, people tend to say, well, it's really fat that drives disease, because fat has so many calories. One spoon of fat is like two or three spoons of everything else. Fat is just rich in calories. And they point out that processed foods are filled with, fried foods and fat. And they say, well, the sugar and salt are important because they make you, they add to the flavor, but it's really basically we're eating too much and we're exercising too little. And they show, hey, you go on a low fat diet, you can lose weight. But the carb people say, hey, it isn't the fat, it's really the carbs, because I can put a person on a low carb diet and they can be eating a ton of fat and they're going to lose weight. And they're right. So how can high fat be the cause if a low carb diet and you're on a high fat blocks it? So they seem to be at war. And one group is saying, hey, it's insulin that drives it. When you're on a high carb diet, the insulin's driving the calories into the tissues and making you fat. And if you cut back on the carbs, you're going to cut back on the insulin. And that's how it works. And the other people say, hey, it's just calories. And, so what our hypothesis did is it brought those two together, because what we found was that carbs either contain or make fructose, right? So when you have carbs, you're eating a lot of carbs, especially the high glycemic carbs, they get converted to fructose. And likewise, if you're taking sugar, you're getting fructose. And we also found that salt tends to help drive that reaction of glucose to fructose. And then when you make fructose, what happens is it makes you hungry. And it also makes you start liking fat. And now there's a big paper in Cell, and actually we talked about it beforehand, but normally you don't have taste buds for fat. You have taste buds for sweet, salt, umami, but there's not a taste bud for fat. But if you give a person sugar, they will start craving fat as well as sugar. And what happens is when you give sugar and they make fructose, you become leptin resistant and you start eating more.
Right.
And once you're eating more, then the energy balance theory is right, because you're eating more food than you're exercising less. But it's not because of preference, it's because of biology. So the low carb diet blocks the fructose effects and makes you leptin sensitive. And then that's why when you go on a low carb diet, you don't have to calorically restrict because you're not hungry. Whereas you're go on a low fat diet, you still have to calorically restrict because you're hungry, because the carbs drive the hunger and then the fat drives the weight gain.
Interesting.
But what we found was that the fructose also has effects independent of weight gain. So if you go on a low calorie diet so that you're not gaining weight, but you're eating a high sugar diet, you'll still become diabetic. You'll still get fatty liver. You'll still get hypertension. You'll still get dementia. So the real problem are carbs.
Skinny fat people, right? Skinny fat.
You can make skinny fat people. You can. I've taken care of people who are, they actually are weightlifters and bodybuilders, and they eat almost nothing because they want to have that rippling muscle. And so they eat very little and they exercise all the time, but they could be eating the wrong food. And if they're eating a high sugar diet, what happens is inside their bodies, it's going to hell, and they're getting fatty liver and all kinds of problems. So anyway, but getting back, those two theories are compatible with the fructose story, because the fructose story says that low carb diet is going to help you. It's going to say that when you go on a low carb diet, you're going to start regulating your weight, and so you can go on a high fat. But if you're taking sugar and fructose and it's going to drive hunger, in which case the fat is going to drive weight gain more than the sugar, because the fat, once you're eating too much, it's all about calories. So anyway, so our theory brought the two together, and we basically can say, hey, you guys are both right. It's just it's a different part of the big story. And the protein leverage story falls into that same game. The protein leverage story says, hey, it argues that we're not eating enough protein, and that protein provides a satiety, makes you less hungry. And what they're saying is that if you increase protein and decrease carbohydrates and fat, that you're going to do well. But in almost every study that's done, they increase the protein and they reduce the carbs. And so it's hard to know which one is the benefit. You can never tell, because when you increase the protein, you're reducing the carbs. And so no one's really done the correct study. But I do think that proteins can have some satiety, but if you really restrict protein, it isn't that you gain fat, you start losing, you start wasting away. So it's not a perfect theory.
Sorry, it would be really interesting, Richard, wouldn't it, to have a study where they increase the protein and they have two groups, one who has a relatively low carbohydrate, but it's mostly glucose or complex, and then the other group has the same amount of carbohydrate, but all fructose. That would be quite an interesting study, right?
Yeah, that would be a very good study. I agree. But anyway, the paleo diets are basically a low sugar diet.
Yeah.
So
that's right.
It's hard to sort it out, but the bottom line is it's compatible with our theory, because the way the papers are, you can't separate it very easily from an effect of reducing carbs versus increasing protein. So
tell
go
us
ahead.
one more theory around weight gain is the seed oil hypothesis. So give us a quick overview of that and how fructose plays into that story as well.
Well, first off, there is this really interesting finding that's been known for a long time, and it's very real. And it goes to the issue that not all fats are equal, that there really are differences in fats. There's saturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, and so forth. But there's one called omega-3, and this is a specific type of polyunsaturated fat. It's like in salmon and walnuts. And there's something about that about that fat that blocks the effects of sugar. And if you give a high sugar diet and you add omega-3, you really can blunt the effects of the sugar. So there is an interaction that needs to be figured out. And it's the kind of thing that my lab can do, but I don't have the answer. But there clearly is a benefit of omega-3 on sugar. And high omega-3 can block some of the effects of sugar. Now, there are seed oils turn out to be omega-6.
Yeah.
And, there's been a long story that omega-6 might be bad guys as opposed to omega-3, which are good guys. And, there are people who looked at the ratio, for example, of omega-3 to 6 in foods. And bottom line is, if you have a low ratio of 3 to 6, that's not good.
Yeah.
But is it because the 3 is low, or is it because the omega-6 is high? And the literature is really mixed when you just look at omega-6. There's some studies that don't see it as anything but calories. And there are other studies that see it as being pro-inflammatory.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons is that omega-6 is a precursor for things called eicosanoids. So these are substances that are made from fat. And what's interesting in what we call these things are eicosanoids or prostaglandins, and they're good prostaglandins and they're bad prostaglandins.
Yeah. There's inflammatory ones and anti-inflammatory
You're
ones, right?
So it turns out that if you're have an inflammatory state and you take omega-6, there's going to be an increased chance those omega-6 are going to be turned into inflammatory ones. Whereas if your biology is really healthy, the omega-6 may turn out to be going down a healthier route to make healthy ones. And so the problem is it's a substrate. You fill yourself up with this stuff, but it can either be pro-inflammatory or not. Now, obesity and metabolic syndrome is a pro-inflammatory state. So if you're eating a lot of seed oils and you're already pre-diabetic, it's probably going to go the inflammatory route, and it won't be good, right?
And
in fact, it won't be good anyway because it's filled with calories.
Yes.
So
it's context,
it's like right. So what I have written is that we know from animal studies that if I give fructose to an animal and I make it leptin resistant so that it wants to eat more, and that's what fructose does, then giving it omega-6 is like giving fat, and they're going to get fat very fast because you've made the animal hungry, so it's eating a lot of fat. So a lot of seed oils, all the seed oils we're eating is providing calories to drive this pathway up, to make you fat. Plus, if you're in a kind of an inflammatory state, which is what fructose does, then the omega-6 may also preferentially be turned into inflammatory prostanoids. So to me, it is a bad guy, but again, it may be dependent on fructose being around.
Yeah.
So, but most of us are eating a lot of carbs and eating a lot of sugar. So we really are in a state where our leptins isn't working that well, and we're kind of in a pre-inflammatory state or beginning of inflammation. So I think seed oils are bad. And so the seed oil hypothesis has been that seed oils are going up, as is obesity. And so the association's there. And I would say, yes, that's a real association. It is causal, but it isn't necessarily that it's just the fat doing it. We're in a high sugar, high carb world.
Yeah.
And what I've pointed out to people like Chris Kenobi and some of these great thinkers who believe in the seed oil hypothesis, that I say, if it's seed oils, then, what about all these people that are on low carb diet, that are in a high fat diet? They're clearly getting large amounts of fat, of which a lot of them come from seed oils. Why don't they show inflammation? Why don't they show all these other things? But yet we know a low carb keto diet blocks inflammation. And so what I think is going on is that when you remove the fructose, the oils aren't so bad.
Yeah.
And that explains the literature, because there's all these studies in young, healthy people where giving them omega-6 doesn't seem to do anything. And so but if you give omega-6 to people who are obese and pre-diabetic, it isn't as good.
And it might be interesting when you look at the vegan diet as well, because they tend to be healthier, eat less sugar, but will have quite a lot of seed oils. And in that population, they may not be an issue, right? Because the proponents.
But then there are the Sikhs who are vegetarian, but they love fried breads and stuff like that, and they get really fat.
Interesting.
I mean, if you're Sikh, please forgive me. It's not like everyone gets fat.
Yeah,
but
they do have
it's
high
a
rates of
diet.
obesity.
It's a diet associated with increased risk for obesity.
Yeah, and I think
I have to be careful.
The other thing, Richard, that's interesting is that people eat food, not necessarily nutrients. And we're talking about the ultra-processed food industry, create a lot of foods that have high glycemic carbs, that are sweetened with high fructose corn syrup, that have seed oils in them, that have salt in them as well, and fat.
Fail.
Right? And so there's everything in a oneer, right?
Yeah, that's the equation. Hey, if you want to design someone to become obese, give them the sugar, give them the high glycemic carbs, give them the salt to help convert it to fructose, give them the fat, and you've got the whole thing. It's perfect.
Yeah.
So again, this pathway explains processed foods. It helps explain the low carb. So what's great about it is it fits all these different theories. And so I think when you start seeing that, you either have to pause and say there must be something wrong, or perhaps we just lucked out and found a hypothesis that can bring everything together. And so when I wrote this unification hypothesis, I did so because I wanted to get out in the literature, and I want to see, the experts respond to say, hey, this isn't right.
Yeah.
But so far, we haven't seen that. It may be coming, but we haven't seen that, and I think that's evidence that this is a pretty strong hypothesis. It's based upon a lot of papers published in Nature journals and JCI, and I mean, it's really the science is pretty strong. It doesn't mean it can't be wrong. It might be wrong.
Well, let's see. I think at the minute, I suspect that there are a lot of researchers. So that researchers get down a path and they nail their colors to that mast. And I think there's a lot of researchers that have read your paper and gone, "Oh shit."
Well, there is this story where people become fanatic about their own hypothesis.
Yes.
And and it can happen to everybody. And I'm aware of it, and I'm not a fanatic. So my belief is you try to produce, a story that best fits the data we have. But it's not a fixed hypothesis. So let's say that 10 years from now, some new study comes up that, questions this hypothesis. Well, then it will hopefully change the hypothesis a little bit to better fit all the data. So science is a working science. It's not an absolute science. And the more, you try to get closer to the truth with each rendition. And I think that this theory helps explain, the sugar idea, the energy balance, the protein leverage, and it can bring these different theories together. And this is a good thing, right? And then what we can do is we'll see, and hopefully maybe someone will find things that will cause this theory to be modified. And that's good.
Yes. And
it's not a defeat.
No, and there's something I read on your website, and I went, this guy's a true, pure scientist, right? I'm going to read it out. I'm not really interested in recognition. The joy is in the discovery and getting it out so people can read about it. The joy is trying to move the needle of science just a little bit more. And
that's it.
If every researcher had that as their foundational idea, I think we'd be so much better off, because particularly in the world of nutrition, there's the diet wars that are out there that people have their hypothesis and they're creating. I've seen the bloody Harvard researchers create like these highly flawed research studies that are just backing up their theory. I now want to talk about, let's just shift and talk about Alzheimer's disease, because as I said at the start, it is not, like 10 years ago, Alzheimer's disease was not in the top 10 killers in Australia. I don't know about the data in the United States. Now it is the second biggest killer of Australians, and it's the first biggest killer of females in Australia, right? And so we have an epidemic of Alzheimer's that is either here right now or is just around the corner. And there's very strong links to obesity and diabetes, obviously. But I think this fructose hypothesis has got a really interesting role to play. So take us through that.
Yeah, so I think it's extremely strong evidence that the fructose story is the underlying primary driver of Alzheimer's. And I'm going to argue this for 3 or 4 reasons. First off, we're recognizing that Alzheimer's is increasing. For a long time, they thought that it was just a detection issue, and it was rare in the 1940s because we didn't really know how to diagnose it compared to other diseases. But that's clearly wrong. Alzheimer's is on the rise, and it's related to obesity and diabetes, and so we have this kind of linkage with these other conditions. And people started looking at what drives Alzheimer's, and they find that sugar intake, carb intake, low omega-3 intake are all risk factors for developing Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is this disease where the brain cells start to die, the brain atrophies, shrinks. It's a horrible disease, and you get these plaques in the brain. And so initially people thinking, oh my God, it's the plaques that are causing the disease. Yeah. And so, for 25 years, people have been trying to figure out how to block the plaque. And when they do, they don't really see that much benefit. So all these programs,
and they've wasted billions of dollars on drug therapies, right?
Right. I mean, you can see maybe a couple of drugs have had tiny bit of benefit, but it's really minimal. So people say, okay, well, if it's not the plaques, what is it? And they started realizing that when the brain's already shrunk, it's kind of late in the game. And what we want to do is to try to prevent it from shrinking, not wait till your brain is 1/4 the size it should be. Yeah. So what they do is they say, well, what are the earliest signs of Alzheimer's? And they found that there were 3. Guess what they were? One was insulin resistance in the brain, not in the body, but in the brain. Another was inflammation in the brain. And the third one was there's some problems with the mitochondria not making enough ATP.
Yeah.
Well, I know that fructose, when you give it to a person, causes insulin resistance systemically. It causes inflammation, and it causes the mitochondrial problem, the same one. So I thought, well, the two are linked. Sugar intake correlates, obesity correlates. Could there be evidence that fructose might be the cause of Alzheimer's? And in fact, if you give sugar to animals, over time, they have trouble getting through a maze. They get the inflammation in the brain. They get the mitochondrial problems in the brain. They get insulin resistance in the brain. And then they start getting plaques after about 18 weeks. So that's pretty significant animal data. And then when you look at people with Alzheimer's, you find that they have high fructose levels in their brain, like 7-fold higher. And all the enzymes that drive Alzheimer's, they're high in the brain. And then when you look at things like uric acid, it's elevated in the brain of early Alzheimer's, which is uric acid is generated when fructose is broken down. So it's all there. The evidence is there. And then more recently, someone just published a study in animals that if you knock out fructose metabolism, you can block dementia from diabetes. And that is linked,
Wow.
So that just got published last month. And then in addition, there's these beautiful studies that keto diets may help, low carb diets may help Alzheimer's. That's exactly what we're thinking. So our work suggests that it's fructose in the brain. And what's interesting is to get fructose in the brain, you have to, not a lot of the fructose we eat actually gets to the brain. But when you eat fructose, it stimulates fructose production in the brain. So the fructose in the sugar you're eating isn't what's the fructose in the brain, but it triggers changes that make you to produce fructose elsewhere.
And so sorry to interrupt, Richard, does high glycemic carbs do the same thing through the polyol pathway, or is it just fructose?
No, it's probably the bigger risk factor.
Right.
And in fact, there's a guy from Yale who did a study in humans. This is scary, okay? He actually just raised the blood glucose in people, and he did a thing called the clamping, where they keep infusing the glucose at a certain rate to maintain a high glycemic, he basically made people sort of like pre-diabetic or even diabetic. Actually, he sort of made them diabetic transiently. And within 40 minutes after the glucose is high, suddenly the brain started making fructose in people. And he showed it in people. And so that's got to be it. I think that, fructose is high in the brain. Sorbit, the polyol pathway is high in the brain. The enzymes are high in the brain. We have people we're working with, and they can show that in Alzheimer's it's the cells called the microglia. It's the macrophage, or the white cell in the brain, starts making a lot of fructose and in the brain. And that seems to be the primary cell, and then that can cause all these different things that can lead to Alzheimer's. So, no one has ever had a hypothesis that goes from the start to the finish. This one does. It explains every step of the way. So, no soft drinks, people.
Yeah, no.
Get rid of your soft drinks. Diet soft drinks are different, but they may have their own issues. But
they got their own issues with the disruption of the gut microbiome, right?
Right.
Just get off the bloody sugar.
Yes, get off the bloody sugar is right. And the high glycemic foods are really a big issue. And the low carb people are right on the money. This is where the low carb people are going to beat out the energy balance people, because it's really about the metabolic effects of carbs, not the weight gain. but the
Yeah.
metabolic effects.
So
So
if we
low
get,
carb diets, intermittent fasting,
yeah.
drink lots of water.
I was just about to say, to get really practical for people, it's massively reducing their consumption of ultra processed foods, right? Because it's got everything that you talked about in the mix right there.
Yeah.
So, and fruit juice evil, soft drinks even more evil. But also is understanding the impact that salt and alcohol has as well on that pathway.
Right.
Can you just go into that for a little bit of for people?
Sure. Yeah. So we found that salt actually can stimulate the production of fructose from carbs, and salt's particularly dangerous on a high carb diet. If you're on an extremely low carb diet, salt's not going to do much because you don't have the carbs to convert to fructose. But we were able to create fat animals by just giving them salt. Wow. And the way it works is the salt increases the salt concentration in the blood. And if you block that, you can block obesity. And so we found that hydration with water could actually help block obesity. And so that for years, people have said, hey, drink water, you're going to lose weight. And the kidney specialists in the world, and they say, well, wait, the kidneys hold on to water. You don't have to, it's not about drinking water. That's a myth. But the truth is, it's real. And now the NIH and other institutes are finding that if you have an elevated serum salt in your blood, and everybody, when you get blood tests, you can just check your,
that's right.
Yeah, just look at your serum sodium or salt. Sodium is kind of sodium chloride is salt. So you look at the serum sodium, and if it's high, you're not drinking enough water. And guess what? It's associated with increased risk for obesity, dementia, metabolic syndrome. So you don't want to have a high salt. And so everyone should drink 8 glasses of water a day. If you're working in the heat, you probably have to drink more than that. You want that urine to be kind of light colored.
Yeah. I think that's the best thing is pee clear, right? But just be aware if you're taking vitamins and minerals that can color the pee. I actually prefer 250 milligrams for every 10 kilos of body weight in terms of water, because the 8 glasses is like, how big's the glass? And does a 120 kilo person need 8 glasses and a 60 kilo?
You're 100% right. I was just being kind of general, but I like what you're saying.
Yeah. So, and I think, Richard, for this, for people, get your bloods checked. And if your blood sugar is high, like above 5.4, 5.5, that's millimoles per liter, which I can't remember translates to the Americans, but people will know. And particularly if there's high salt in your diet, you've got to get on the program bloody quick, because obesity, diabetes, and Alzheimer's disease will be just around the corner. So, Richard, look, this has been wonderful discussion, as wonderful as reading your papers, and it is an absolute honor to have you on. Now, in terms of where people go, I know you've got 4 books, or 4 popular books out there, and then a more serious book. You've got the sugar switch, the fat switch, and Nature Wants You to Be Fat. Is that sorry? That's 3 popular books.
Nature Wants Us to Be Fat is my most recent one, right. And that's the one I would most recommend because it's the most up to date. The fat switch is a lot more about evolution and nature, so you might find that interesting. But
if you're a geek like me, that one. But if you just want the practical stuff, Nature Wants You to Be Fat.
Yeah, that's the one that's really up to date.
Yeah, cool. And people can go to your website, drrichardjohnson.com, and you're a bit trendy because you're also on Instagram as well.
I am on Instagram, and I need to go back on it. I haven't been on it for a while, but yeah, Dr. Richard J. Johnson.
Okay. Richard, this has been bloody awesome. On behalf of the entire human race, I thank you for your work, and I thank you for your attitude towards science, that it's all about moving the needle. And you've certainly helped move the needle in this.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. It was a great pleasure being on your program.
Awesome.